may not have that many flaws, but the ordinance has much more flaws. The ordinance tooth implant, Professor K.D. Rao knows about it much better than anyone else, and then offense implant surgery. In section 354, they implanted 5 new offenses. In section 375, 76, they implanted new offenses. The implant surgery. Now, what is the issue? I would leave, before I leave to Madam Chandra and to Mrinal and Nipun, I would make a brief comment. The whole rape law is a product of patriarchal society mindset. And that's why the language I pointed this out in Kids' public lecture, that the exemption given to the husband is intercourse by a husband with his own wife. Owned wife. Own a dog, own a cow, own a wife. That is the language in the 1860 IPC, in later amended IPC, and in the ordinance also. Own wife. As if you will permit intercourse with another's wife also. That was very kind of them, could have done it. So, with the own wife, own is the villain of peace. The ownership concept. Wife is a commodity which can be owned. Now, the other thing is the implant in place of section 375. The whole feminist movement, and very well captured by Nicola Lacey and Celia Wells in restructuring criminal law, they have said sexual offences should constitute, the majority of sexual offences should constitute a separate chapter, distinct chapter of offences against human integrity and individual autonomy. Merely making it gender neutral will not make any difference. You have to understand that by mere use of a finger or a innocuous object in the rectum, you don't harm the body alone. Much more than the body, you harm the integrity of a man or a woman. Equally, it is his autonomy. I have an autonomy to keep my body intact, untouched. So that is when you try implant strategy in section 375, which falls in section chapter 16 of the IPC, which is an offence against human body, woman or a self-respecting man doesn't lie in the body alone. He lies much beyond the body. This needed a message. This is an outdated, old classification of offences. This has to be discarded. But instead you have done implant strategy. 509 को भी section 354 में ले. 509 is an offence of intimidation. You have brought it in 354, 354 offences against human body, to showing pornographic films to a woman is also. Now this is not an offence against body. It offends the sensibility of the woman. She has a right. It is an offence against her privacy, not her body. Therefore, हम लोग implant strategy में we forgot this, and this happens because we are treating, and that is where is a big, against Verma committee also, some charge, that we think that by changing the substantive criminal law, everything will become all right. The flaw is not so much in the substantive criminal law. Certainly, substantive criminal law, the changes that it requires, the flaw is in the procedural criminal law. Substantive criminal law is retrospective. It cannot be, the agitation was saying to these 7 rapists, apply 6 rapists, apply harsh measures. But substantive criminal law will not apply to these people. But procedural criminal law, if that was changed, CRPC provisions were changed, evidence law provisions were changed, it could apply retrospectively. It could apply to them. But you have changed very little there. You have changed very little there because for changing that you need change in the policing attitudes. You change the judicial attitude. You change the lawyer's attitude. That change is much more difficult than merely changing the substantive law. So they have taken the simple course. Verma committee has taken आसान चीज जो है वो करो, ज़्यादा कठिन चीज में मत जाओ, बस प्रॉब्लम हो जाएगी. The problem you have avoided, but in the sense you have given quick justice, very quick response to the agitation, but it cannot be said to be a substantial response. Substantial response will come only if procedural changes were made. Substantial response will come only if this implant strategy could suggest an alternative, either section chapter 15A or 16A, in which offences against human integrity, individual autonomy. And then you could have kept quite a few of the sexual offences in that chapter. Therefore, if you just think that they are part of, now with that little introduction, and I think that this was also not necessary, because you have a panel of people who have really devoted much time on the Verma committee, Nipun Saxena and Mrinal and Chandra. I think we'll start with Chandra first and then Mrinal and then Nipun will follow up. Because Nipun has filed a PIL in the Supreme Court, which is in quite ripe stage now, and I think we may get something from the Supreme Court itself. Then Madam Chandra.
Thank you, Professor Pandey. Our division of labor, at least the division of labor between Mrinal and me, is that I will look at some of the long-standing demands for reform in India's criminal law framework dealing with sexual violence, and then Mrinal will take on from there to look at how the Verma committee dealt with those demands and how the ordinance that has come after the Verma committee has responded to both the Verma committee and to the long-standing demands of people engaged in law reform across the country and even across the world. So that's my brief today. If you look at the reforms that have already taken place, so that took place before this particular round of reforms, post the Mathura protests, the reforms in 1983 made custodial rape an aggravated offence, introduced certain evidentiary presumptions regarding consent in aggravated rape. In 2003, there was an amendment to Section 154 of the Indian Evidence Act to repeal the provision which made the past sexual history of a woman relevant in adjudicating rape. However, a lot of other demands remained. Like I said, in these remarks, I will be highlighting the tenor of most of these demands. But I want to start by taking off on a point that Professor Pandey mentioned, which was that the larger demand of at least feminist groups dealing with or engaged in rape law reform was the need for a reorientation of our thinking about rape law. What is rape an offence of? Is it just a crime of sex? Is it what causes rape? Why do people rape? Do people rape because of deviant sexual desires, uncontrollable sexual urges, or is there something more to this? So the broad tenor of reform that was sought was to reorient our understanding of rape law reform, of rape law and sexual violence, from a male-oriented perspective, of what is considered to be a male-oriented perspective, where rape was seen as a violence against a woman's chastity and against her body, so that the offence takes place when a woman's body is penetrated, and that is the moment when the offence really takes place, and that is the serious offence, and everything else is minor and is just outraging the modesty of a woman. So the idea that rape is an offence against the chastity and body of a woman, to an understanding, to a reframing of sexual violence, to think of it as a violence against a person's personal integrity and sexual autonomy. So really constitutionalizing the idea of a woman's sexual autonomy and personal integrity. And I say woman advisedly because there's a lot of feminist groups still argue that and argue quite often persuasively that it's only women who should come within the ambit of victims of rape, but I'll come to that issue. Anyway, so the prime reorientation, the most fundamental reorientation that was being sought was to move it out of antiquated ideas of sexual violence as violence against a woman's chastity or only a violence against her body, to look at it as a violence of her constitutional freedoms, of her sexual autonomy and her physical and her personal integrity. I also wanted to highlight that even before the Delhi gang rape, in December itself, in the beginning of December, on December 4th, the Criminal Law Amendment Bill 2012 was introduced in the Lok Sabha for the amendment of rape laws. Now, the bill was severely criticized by groups on all sides, on all points of the spectrum. It's still it's pending before Parliamentary Standing Committee. Its current fate is quite unknown after this ordinance. But for what it's worth, I will discuss how the bill addressed some of these key demands and controversies in the criminal law framework on sexual violence as well. So just to remind ourselves, the IPC structure of sexual offences pre-ordinance was as follows. Section 354 and 509 dealt with outraging the modesty of a woman. 354 dealt with contact-based outraging of modesty of a woman when there was contact involved, and 509 dealt with non-contact based outraging of modesty, which is non-contact based harassment, for example, you can call it, by words, gestures, etc., etc., with a maximum punishment of 2 years. Rape invited a minimum punishment of 7 years and included only penile vaginal penetration, which was an integral element of the crime. And aggravated rape invited a minimum punishment of 10 years and took place in certain contexts like custodial contexts or other forms of aggravated rape. 377 dealt with other unnatural offences, very broadly worded term, which included homosexuality, and that scope of consensual, including consensual homosexual acts, and that matter is pending before the Supreme Court right now. It also includes other non-penile vaginal penetrative acts. So in the Delhi gang rape instance, for example, because objects were used to penetrate the body of the victim, the perpetrators, the accused, have been charged under 377 as well, and that carries a maximum punishment up to life. Now, a key demand of women's groups in particular working and other law reformers working in this area was to widen the definition of rape, to move away from a phallocentric understanding, an understanding that rape is wrong because it involves sex with a woman without her consent, and sex being understood only as penile vaginal penetration, as if women experience sexual violence only when they are penetrated by the penis. So move away from the phallocentric understanding to include other penetrative acts as well, like object penetration, so with other objects like rods, etc., or penetration of other bodily orifices. Now this is something that the Criminal Law Amendment Bill 2012 did. It widened the scope of rape, called it sexual assault, and included other penetrative acts as well. Another demand was that for non-penetrative acts, the language of modesty, the language of outraging the modesty of a woman was very problematic, because it calls up a flawed and very stereotypical notion of womanly deportment and conduct, and supposedly innate feminine characteristics of decency and reserve. And this is very problematic because when a woman does not fall within these stereotypical notions, then it's difficult for a court and for the legal system to comprehend whether her modesty has been violated or not. And so then a lot of discussion goes on to whose modesty can be violated, when can modesty be violated, etc., etc. So less than happy wording, there was a call for changing the less than happy wording. The second problem, of course, was that acts ranging from street harassment, what is called eve teasing, if you can call it that, street harassment is a better term, to other forms of verbal, physical, sexual harassment and molestation, anything falling short of an attempt to rape was all covered under section 354 and 509 with a maximum punishment of only 2 years, whereas rape had a minimum punishment of 7 years. So there was no gradation, no proportionality in the offences. So anything falling short of an attempt to rape would then be amount to outraging the modesty of a woman. The Criminal Law Amendment Bill increased the punishment up to 5 years but retained the less than happy wording. A third problem with the separate treatment of outraging the modesty and rape was that intent requirements are different in outraging the modesty and in rape. In rape, what matters, the way rape is both currently defined under the ordinance and was defined in the IPC pre-ordinance, was that it was the woman's consent that mattered. So rape occurs when a man has sexual intercourse with a woman without her consent. It is a question of a woman's consent that is important. Whereas under outraging the modesty, it is the man's intention to outrage the modesty or knowledge to outrage the modesty that is also relevant. Now under the Vishakha guidelines, the Supreme Court had, and I know Vishakha is not directly relevant to the criminal law framework, but drawing on international experiences, the Vishakha guidelines, the Supreme Court had established a victim-centric understanding of what amounts to sexual harassment. So look at it from the perspective of the victim. When does the victim experience sexual harassment? And rape has that, but outraging the modesty of a woman does not. Interestingly, in this context, the Criminal Law Amendment Bill, because it expanded the scope of rape into sexual assault and included other penetrative acts as well, had to define when penetrative acts would amount to sexual assault, and said that when this penetration was carried out for a sexual purpose. Now the sexual purpose requirement also brought in an intent requirement and was severely criticized, and one of the alternatives that was placed before both before the Verma committee and has constantly been argued is to look at a more objective sexual nature test, whether the penetration was of a sexual nature, whether the act was of a sexual nature, to be understood in the totality of circumstances rather than to look at the sexual purpose of the accused. So right now, so under the Criminal Law Amendment Bill, the sexual purpose was introduced. That does not find place in the current ordinance, but I'm getting ahead of myself. However, the small point that I want to make is that between outraging the modesty of a woman and sexual assault or rape, there was a difference in intent requirements. Now another issue, and this is a very divisive issue within various groups engaged in progressive law reform, is the issue of gender neutrality, whether rape ought to be gender neutral. Now on the one hand, the departure from this heteronormative conception, only a man can rape only a woman. The idea that sexual offences take place where men are perpetrators and women are the victims, moving away from this heteronormative conception, brings within the protective ambit of the law other groups that are particularly vulnerable to sexual violence, so including those of alternative sexuality as well as those who do not conform to gender and sexual binaries, so people with a variety of trans identities. But on the other hand, the argument of a lot of women's groups was that the move delinks law from the current social realities where sexual violence is a particularly gendered form of violence and where women are predominantly the victims and rarely are the perpetrators. Further, and this I think goes more to the heart of the concern, that in a world, in an unequal world, where there are already many harm minimizing and blame shifting narratives that exist around sexual violence. You know, she asked for it, she led him on, she herself wanted it, she enjoyed it. When you already have these harm minimizing, blame shifting narratives, gender neutrality can have the effect of adding another layer of victim blaming to the offense. She is the one who started it, she did it, not me. So there is this very important concern about how gender neutrality, the idea of formal gender neutrality in law, will play out against a background condition of deep and pervasive inequality. So the common meeting point though is that both sides of the debate understand, both people arguing particularly on behalf of LGBT groups or other groups such as the disabled, for example, and women and those arguing to retain the gender neutrality, particularly women's organizations. Both sides of the debate understand that rape is not only a result of uncontrollable sexual urges or deviant sexual desires, but is also a demonstration of power and control, a form of establishment of hierarchy and dominance, and an effort to subjugate, humiliate, and often to punish social transgressions through the infliction of sexual violence. So that rape operates and is embedded in social power differentials. So given the sexual nature of this violence, groups that are typically viewed as gendered bodies, as erotic bodies, women's, gays, lesbians, transsexuals, transgender, gender non-conformists are most at risk from such violence. The via media that both groups have reached, or all sides of the debate have reached, is that rape ought to have a gender-specific perpetrator, that is, a man is the only one who can commit the offense, and a gender-neutral victim. So recognizing that the current state of play where gender power differential might operate against groups of men also, or other axis of power differential might operate against other groups other than women also, but generally the perpetrator are male. So recognizing that via media, and this is still an open issue for question, it's not as if people are very comfortable along any point of the spectrum, but this is a compromise solution that has been reached in much of the discussions and discourses around gender neutrality. However, that's not really translated into our law. Another issue that was hotly debated was the issue of age of consent, whether the age of consent age of sexual consent ought to be raised from 16 to 18. Now, under the IPC pre-ordinance, the age of consent was 16. It was raised under the Prevention of the Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act, which was passed in 2012. The age of consent was raised to 18 already, and now the ordinance also keeps it at 18. This was also the case under the Criminal Law Bill 2012. Now this, of course, on the one hand, a lot of child rights activists have argued that that children are particularly susceptible to sexual violence, and that therefore you should have an age of consent at 18. On the other hand, many groups argue that this prohibits sexual experimentation that happens rampantly in any case, both in urban areas and in rural areas. It criminalizes behavior that is otherwise natural, that it leads to a lot of misuse and moral policing. So one grave concern is that a lot of the statutory rape cases that are already filed and also are generally accompanied by kidnapping charges happen when parents disapprove of the sexual relations made by young adults. So for example, when a girl has a relationship with a boy of a different caste, for example, or has a relationship with a boy that the parents disapprove of, there's already a tendency to misuse this law and the law relating to kidnapping in order to clamp down on romance. So so there's a concern that this will lead to greater misuse and to greater moral policing, both policing by the moral police and by the state. So those are some of the issues that have come up with respect to the age of consent. And just to briefly point out that the IPC, just on the issue of consent, the IPC has no positive definition of consent, it just has a negative definition of consent. So there was always a demand for introducing a positive definition of consent. Wasn't so in the Criminal Law Amendment Bill, but both the Verma Committee and the Ordinance have that definition, so we'll look at that. Then there was an issue of zones of impunity, which the IPC had with respect to when rape was either not recognized or was not adequately prohibited, or there were other procedural mechanisms through which there was virtual impunity for rape. So these zones of impunity included the home, where marital rape, for example, was exempted. So there was a marital rape exemption, and of course the Professor Pandey has already talked about it, so I'm not going to go into details. There was another problem was that post Mathura, when custodial violence was custodial rape was made into an aggravated offence, there was a very spatial understanding of what constituted custodial rape, which is when a person was in the custody of a police or in the charge of a public servant. And what amounted to custody and what amounted to charge was defined in a very limited circumstance, in a very limited manner. So, for example, the Supreme Court has held that a teacher having sexual relations with a student on the ground that and forcing her to have sexual relations with him on the ground that if she did not engage in sexual relations, he would fail her. This would not be covered under the charge of a public servant provision, because this happened outside the precincts of the school. So this idea of a very spatial understanding of where sexual and social power dynamics operate was a very problematic provision, and there was a repeated attempt to repeated demand to change that. And just finally, just going to very briefly touch on some other points and conclude my remarks. There was a problem with virtual impunity granted to the army under the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which has very stringent sanction requirements, and not a single sanction has been given so far. And the requirement of civilian trial, there was a demand that offences by the army should also come under, or army personnel should also be tried in civilian courts. There was one of the main problems that a victim faces when they approach the police, for example, is reporting that the police is the registering of an FIR. Police often don't register, so one of the long-standing demands was to provide stringent punishment for police officers who don't register, and to provide alternate mechanisms by which a victim can access the legal system and not just channeled through the police. Medical exam protocols, there's a India still regularly conducts the two-finger test, which is not only demeaning and dehumanizing, but is also another form of raping the victim all over again. So there was a demand for having clear medical protocols all over the country to address the issue of re-victimizing a rape victim through the medical examination process. And finally, just to quickly wrap up, the issue of punishment. There have been different demands by different groups, and not everyone agrees to these, but demands have been made for increasing the punishment. Either some groups demand increasing the punishment to life. Some groups demand increasing the punishment to life, meaning life and not just 14 years. Others have demanded the death penalty, and then again things like chemical and surgical castration. So these are the kind of issues that have come up in the debates around sexual violence and the criminal law framework governing sexual violence in the past few years, particularly post Mathura. These are the core issues that the rape law reform movement has been grappling with. I will hand it over to Mrinal then to talk about how the Verma Committee dealt with these issues, and then how the ordinance has addressed these issues.
So I'll quickly go through as far as I can, of the 631 pages of the Verma Committee report. There's a synopsis of part of the criminal amendments, Appendix 4 of the Verma Committee report, which is on page number 434 onwards. On page 28 of this souvenir and abstracts that has been given to you, there is a synopsis. This is a part synopsis. A synopsis of part of the sections here does not cover sections 375 and 376. Two of us here who had worked with the committee had prepared the synopsis, and the day we issued the synopsis, the ordinance came out, so we didn't know whether it was useful to do a part 2, which we're probably going to do in any case. Right, so if you look at what the mandate of the Justice Verma Committee was when it was set up on 23rd of December 2012, after the incident of December 16, it was very focused. And if you look at Justice Verma's letter to the Prime Minister, that has the mandate. It's I quote what Justice Verma has said: "This committee was constituted by the Government of India by government notification dated so and so, to look into possible amendments to the criminal law to provide for quicker trial and enhanced punishment for criminals committing sexual assault of extreme nature against women." So you could see what the government actually was hinting at, and I think the ordinance very clearly indicated what the government was hinting at. They were saying that give the death penalty, bring the death penalty into, so it's up there, right, so that's where I was reading from. So if you just look at it very narrowly, you could say that the committee was asked to only look at criminals committing sexual assaults of extreme nature and provide for enhanced punishments. But the committee saw its role in a much broader way. What the committee said was, look, if you have to look at the issue of sexual assault itself, then you can't confine yourself to extreme nature aggravated sexual assaults, or you cannot confine yourselves to quicker trial and enhanced punishments. You need to look at what is causing this. And you need to look at the systemic issues that cause rape in Indian society. And you need to look at the broader constitutional issues. And that is the point at which the committee begins its entire exercise here. And the first chapter of the report itself talks about the entire, chapter 1 talks about constitutionalism, republicanism and gender equality. And what the committee says is that if we have to place this entire crime in the constitutional framework, what are these crimes against women of a sexual nature doing? They are restricting a woman's rights under Articles 19 and 21 of the Constitution of India. Their right to freedom to move freely across the territory, their right to take up employment of their choice, their right to life and liberty under Article 21 is being curtailed. Now, if these constitutional rights are being violated, then you need to have your laws to be in tune with the Constitution for it to have any effect. And this is not only the substantive law, but the procedural laws as well. At the same time, with Article 14, you need to have equality. Everybody needs to be equal. You cannot separate people on various bases, or be it victims or be it offenders. And it's in that broad background that the committee begins its work. The committee also notes that the issue is of sexual autonomy. It is not a question of only offense against the human body. It's a question of a woman's sexual autonomy. And I'll get into the gender neutrality question later. I'm going to first talk about the woman as a victim of the crime. And so therefore it's a question of sexual autonomy and sexual freedom. And if such sexual autonomy is violated, then automatically the law has to follow there and provide for a sanction. At the same time, the law with respect to rape, if you look at how the courts have viewed it, how the entire legal system has viewed it, it has viewed it in terms of a shame-honor issue. Courts have consistently said that women feel shame when they are raped. And the Supreme Court in 1980, Justice Krishna, in the judgment of State of Uttar Pradesh versus Rafiq, said a woman experiences a deep sense of deathless shame when she is raped. And that gets cited continuously till date. There was a judgment of the Supreme Court in 1983 in the case of Barwada Boginbai, Hirjibai versus State of Gujarat. All of these are in the report. All these cases are mentioned in the report. In the Barwada case, the Supreme Court, the issue before the Supreme Court was whether the testimony of the woman can be taken alone to convict the offender? Can the sole testimony be sufficient to convict the offender of the charge of rape? And in the process of saying that it should be, the Supreme Court created a stereotypical rape victim. And that stereotypical rape victim would be someone who would feel very ashamed when raped, would feel ostracized, would not want to face society, would be a virgin, would treasure her chastity, and various such issues. Read with the CRPC provisions, for instance, you have section 280 in the CRPC, the Code of Criminal Procedure, which says that a judge has to note the demeanor of the witness when she is testifying. So courts regularly make a notation that the woman was crying, she was not crying, she felt giddy, she asked for water, and all these things. And if you look at judgments of court subsequently, some of these issues become the basis on which the court decides whether to believe the woman or not. So this entire shame, honor, jurisprudence that the Indian courts had built, and the same thing also percolated to police stations. So if a woman went confidently to a police station saying, I've been sexually assaulted, the police would say, but you don't look like it. Right? It doesn't appear that you have been sexually assaulted, you're not crying, your clothes are not disheveled, etc., etc. That went into medical examination as well. You have documentation of doctors writing in the medical reports, mental condition perfect, does not appear to have been raped, and then the mindset is of, because she's not feeling shame, she has not been raped. And that issue is addressed in the report, but the report says we need to move away from this. We need to move away from this shame, honor issue. Women in India have to have the freedom to behave however they want to, and you should not expect them to feel, there might be shame involved. The committee recognizes there might be shame involved in it, but it depends from individual to individual. So you cannot categorize and stereotype people, and that's a broader issue that the committee talks about. And it recognizes that some of these things are deep mindsets, these are issues of patriarchy, and therefore the committee talks about electoral reforms, educational reforms, police reforms, and that's the broader part of the report. Now, let me look, there are two issues that I'd like to address, broad issues I'd like to address. One is the committee recognizing that one core issue is the trafficking of women and children. And trafficking, the committee felt, which is why it devoted a lot of space in this report and then also brought in a section on trafficking in the amendment bill, was that trafficking is causing a violation of sexual autonomy of women and of course children were trafficked and brought into sex trade, one, and into other forced labor as well. At the same time, the condition of our juvenile homes and the manner in which the Juvenile Justice Act is being implemented is also something that the committee comments on, saying that the juvenile homes in some states, in some places it's running very well, but in some states seems to be creating recidivism by encouraging young people who are in those homes to commit crimes rather than providing them education or any sort of support that they require. So then I'd like to speak about Appendix 4 of the report, which deals with the Criminal Law Amendment Bill and the suggestions made in with regard to amending the IPC, CRPC and Evidence Act and the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. There's some very interesting provisions. One is the committee recommended that if you are on, can you come to page 435? Right, on page 435 of the report, the committee recommended that if a public servant does not record information regarding the commission of a sexual offence, then that should be made a punishable offence. So therefore, this was to ensure that police officers who refuse to record FIRs be brought within the ambit of the law and that they be punished. Side by side, I will also talk about the ordinance. So the ordinance accepted this and reduced the punishment from 5 years that the committee had recommended, reduced it to 1 year. The other thing that the committee did was with respect to section 354, that's on page number 436, next page. Section 354, the language of section 354 as it existed in the Indian Penal Code, like Aparna already mentioned, used the modesty language, and this language of modesty went against what the committee had spoken about earlier, the honor, shame and Article 21, 14, 19 argument. So the committee proposed that it be changed, that the modesty language be removed and it be renamed sexual assault and punishment for sexual assault. And this would involve both touch and non-touch offences. Professor Pandey has pointed out how that probably was a mistake because it's not strictly offence against human body. But what the committee had done, which the ordinance fails to do, was create two separate forms. One is touch and other is non-touch, and separate punishments for that. The ordinance completely ignores this and comes up with its own, retains section 354, retains the modesty language. The ordinance also introduces the offence of sexual harassment. The ordinance, as I read it, is basically a cut and paste job of three different legislations. One is the Sexual Harassment Against Women in the Workplace Bill, which is pending in Parliament, has been cut and put here. Then there's the Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act, which was passed by Parliament in 2012, which has been cut wholesale and put into section 375 and 376. Little bit of the Verma committee report put in at one corner and the other corner, and the Criminal Law Amendment Bill of 2012 also liberally introduced. And then you say 90% of the Verma committee's report has been used. It is a farcical statement, is absolutely false. What the government basically did was picked up most of the Evidence Act and CRPC amendments, which are very important. Those are there. They brought in the offences of voyeurism and stalking and trafficking, and except this, everything else was discarded. And the government, obviously in Parliament, needs to say why they have done this entire thing. So there were three offences that the committee, new offences that the committee proposed. One was with respect to public disrobing of a woman, which was through the public hearings, the committee was informed, is an act that takes place especially in the course of caste-related violence, and therefore it was important to introduce that. The offence of voyeurism and stalking, which are there in the IT Act, in the Information Technology Act, but not there with respect to offline voyeurism and stalking, which has been introduced here. The language is predominantly from the IT Act. Then the offence of trafficking, to address the issue of trafficking. When we look at section 375 and 376, there were various representations made with respect to gender neutrality and not having gender neutrality, and that is a wide-ranging debate. So the committee decided that as of now, the best course of action would be to say that the offender will always be male, but the victim can be male, female, transgender, and others as well, and that is language that the committee uses. So then there are various series of offences that the committee brings in. The explanations, which are on page number 440, are important because the committee brought in the definition of consent. Explanation 4, as in the Verma committee's recommendation, says, consent means an unequivocal voluntary agreement when the person by words, gestures, or any form of non-verbal communication communicates willingness to participate in the specific act, provided that a person who does not offer actual physical resistance to the act of penetration is not by reason only of that fact to be regarded as consenting to the sexual activity. So this is one of the first times in an Indian legislature, this was taken by the ordinance. The ordinance now has a clear definition of consent as well. So that is one of the important contributions made by the Verma committee, which was taken into the ordinance. Further, in the context for punishment for rape, what the committee did is that it retained the minimum at 7 years and said maximum would be life, and also said that at least the medical expenses of the victim should be borne by the accused, and all those recommendations have been rejected by the ordinance. It also introduced various new sections with respect to custodial rape. One very important thing which the law did not consider was with respect to differently abled people, physically and mentally challenged people, and there were various representations made by these groups with respect to the manner in which sexual violence takes place against these groups, which the law did not recognize. So the committee brought in some of these recommendations, which the ordinance fortunately still has. In terms of punishment, what the committee felt was that having the death sentence is not something that is useful, and because there were arguments against the death penalty. So the committee suggested that in cases where death or persistent vegetative state results from the offence of rape, In those cases, life imprisonment would mean imprisonment for the person's entire natural life. Of course, there are pros and cons to this, the criticism of this, but the committee chose to put that in. Also, the committee introduced a new offence of offence of breach of command responsibility. This is taken from the international criminal law context. This definition that the committee has put in was there in the NAC draft to the communal violence bill. And what this basically does is says that if a person who's in a position of authority, be it a police officer, is aware, either knew or owing to the circumstances should have known that persons under his or her command, control or supervision would commit such offences and does not take or fail to take necessary and reasonable measures within his or her power to prevent or repress the commission of the said offence, would be liable to a lesser punishment, but would be liable for the offence of command responsibility, which would put an obligation on superior officers to ensure that people under them, subordinate to them, do not commit crimes of a systematic attack type of crimes against a certain group of people or women. So these were broadly what the IPC recommendations were. What did the ordinance do? The ordinance, the very troubling part, at least to me, in the ordinance is section 375 itself. What the ordinance does, it equates touch and non-touch offences and calls both of them rape. So there is no distinction made between penetrative and non-penetrative acts. This is a huge problem in respect of even classification of offences, and a huge problem from the perspective of punishment, because you're not considering the proportionality theory at all when you are making this. And so at the same time you raise the age of consent from 16 to 18, and so therefore, like, let me read 375E to you. 375E says, if a person touches the vagina, penis, anus or breast of the person, or makes the person touch the vagina, penis, anus or breast of that person or any other person, will be liable. So therefore you have a situation where these non-touch offences, without, Aparna spoke about the criminal amendment bill talking about a sexual purpose or sexual intent. The committee had removed that sexual purpose bit from section 375 because that brought in an element of a person being able to argue that I did this act but I had no sexual purpose in doing that. To get rid of that argument, the committee removed that, but the ordinance goes one step further and says if any of these acts happen, be it with or without with sexual intent or purpose, it will come in, it will have the same punishment. And then what the committee also does, by raising the age of consent, it says any sexual act with a person less than 18 years of age is aggravated rape, punishable with a minimum of 10 years imprisonment. So basically, it's documented that a lot of cases of statutory rape that happen in India are of same age group individuals who might be in a consensual relationship. Of course, they should be punished if they indulge in underage sex under the age of 16. The law says so, and you have to punish. But if you raise that to 18 and also cover non-penetrative acts, it creates a draconian law, in my opinion, and you have a 10-year punishment as well. The other thing that the committee, the ordinance did, which is highly problematic, is that for repeat offenders, under section 376E in the ordinance, it introduces the death penalty. And a repeat offender can be an offender who commits two of these non-penetrative sexual acts and is now liable to be given the death penalty. And it either shows complete non-application of mind or the government becoming very retributive in its approach. I'll quickly go through the CRPC and evidence amendments, which the ordinance has picked up most of what Justice Verma committee recommended, except a couple of important provisions in my opinion. The committee recommended, this is page 447, the committee recommended insertion of two sections in the CRPC, amendment to two sections in the CRPC. One is section 39 of the CRPC, which says that a person is under an obligation, legal obligation, to report a certain set of offences. That did not include sexual offences. And studies show that a lot of people get to know about sexual offences but don't report them. So to put an obligation on those people, section 39(1) was recommended that it be amended and all these sections be put in that. The ordinance does not accept that recommendation. The other was section 40A of the CRPC, which the committee suggested be added. Now, under section 40 of the CRPC, a person employed in connection with the affairs of a village, including a panchayat member or the sarpanch, is required to inform the nearest magistrate or police of offences that have taken place in that jurisdiction. Again, it's something that is noted that in cases of rape, panchayats have done mediation and have done things that the constitution or the law does not permit them to do. So to put an obligation on the panchayat, the committee recommended insertion of a new section which the ordinance does not accept. The other things that the committee did was to say that in terms of filing of FIRs, the police should be able to take the women police officers should be there. There should be special procedures for people who are differently abled. It also suggested that if, as far as possible, statements be recorded by a judicial magistrate, so that then the person cannot retract from that statement. The two new provisions were suggested be introduced, 164 subsection 5A and 5B. The ordinance states that, where it said that if a person is physically or mentally challenged, then a judicial magistrate should take the assistance of a special educator or someone who's trained in dealing with people who are differently able to record their statements, and that these people not be required to be called to court to be examined in chief. Only cross-examination would be provided, so that they're not put through the same process over and over again. One very interesting issue is that, of course, I didn't mention because it's already been said that the committee recommended that the marital rape exception be removed and marital rape be made an offence. Because it said that, there was a corresponding provision in the Indian Penal Code which said that rape by a man on his wife who had been separated would be an offence. So the committee said remove that, because if marital rape is an offence, you have to remove that. What the government did, very interestingly, is in the ordinance brought that back, increased the punishment, and the ministers have been making statements saying, see, we brought in marital rape into the ordinance and have increased the punishment. And of course, it was already there, and it was to deal with people who were legally separated. The committee also recommended insertion of section 198B in the CRPC, which said in cases of marital rape, only the wife can file the FIR. For some strange reason, that is still there in the ordinance. They removed the marital rape. They did not remove the marital rape exemption, but left the CRPC provision, which was supposed to go with that, in that, which shows how much deeply they read the report. With respect to the Evidence Act, the one issue that I'd like to highlight is the issue of past sexual history. When section 155 subsection 4 of the Indian Evidence Act was repealed in 2003, it dealt only with the issue of putting questions on the past sexual history to a woman in her cross-examination. It did not cover any other aspects of the trial. Now, the Criminal Law Amendment the Criminal Law Amendment Bill of 2012 wanted to extend that to cover issue where consent was an issue. The Verma committee felt that it should not only be where consent is an issue, but in a criminal proceeding involving rape, why should the past sexual history of the woman be relevant at any stage of the proceeding? So therefore, it recommended that it be completely removed. The ordinance does not accept that recommendation. It brings back what the Criminal Law Amendment Bill had suggested, where it is only in the context of the issue of consent. So I've gone as fast as I could to cover a major part of the report. So if there are any questions, I think we can take it up in the Q&A.
Thank you so much. So now we have filed public interest litigation before the Supreme Court of India, and we have raised 4 prominent grounds. Firstly, that the State Transport Authority should be directed to immediately cancel all permit licenses of such permit holders who are acting in contravention of the Motor Vehicles Act, the Delhi Motor Vehicle Rules, and the Central Motor Vehicle Rules. Now, there are 86 such violations which have repeatedly been reported, which goes on to suggest that women particularly feel very unsafe while commuting in Delhi. Also, that the number of those private buses as to public buses is, and what I'm telling is the registered number of private buses as to public buses is 40,000 is to a minimal 5,000 of DTC buses. So one can just imagine the magnitude of the problem, because there are such permit holders who are operating without licenses. The licenses have expired, and there are other host of other violations which I cannot surmise in this in this span of time. The second question which I posed before the Honorable Supreme Court is that there has to be a mechanism of rehabilitation of victims of rape and other sexual assault. Now, in 1995, a three-judge bench of the Supreme Court of India and Delhi Domestic Working Women's Forum versus Union of India categorically stated that within 6 months of the passing of the date of this judgment, the central government and the Ministry of Women and Child Development and the National Commission of Women will take such steps to establish this board within 6 months, and this board is to become operative in that 6-month deadline that the Supreme Court had given. And that was the mandate under Article 38 subclause 1 read with Article 15 subclause 3 of the Constitution of India. However, 17 years have passed and no such board has been established. Now, the victimological aspect, I must admit, is not related to an academic discourse itself. It has to be manifested in the law as well. Now, there were various committees that were appointed. The Law Commission of India as well, the Malimat Committee, and even Justice Verma Committee have categorically highlighted that the approach should be victim-centric. Now, the 84th, the 152nd, 154th, 156th, 172nd and 221st report of the Law Commission of India have gone and established a jurisprudential analysis into why victimological approach is required and is compelling. However, no such steps have been taken, but for the fact that in pursuance to the Justice Malimat Committee report and the 156th Law Commission report of India, there was a provision that was inserted, a host of provisions that were inserted in the Criminal Procedure Act, Criminal Procedure Code, which were Section 2AA and Section 357A, a proviso to Section 372 of the CRPC. Now, Section 2AA for the very first time defined who is a victim. Section 357A talked about paying compensation to the victim. Earlier, it was being made operational under Section 357, which essentially had a huge lacuna. However, I will deliberate on Section 357A first, so that we will talk about what the law is and what actually is the ground reality. 357A states, and I will only read subclause 1 and subclause 2 of the relevant provision. Every state government, in coordination with the central government, shall prepare a scheme for providing funds for the purpose of compensation to the victim or his dependents who have suffered loss or injury as a result of the crime and who require rehabilitation. Subclause 2 goes on to suggest that wherever a recommendation is made by the court for compensation, the District Legal Services Authority or the State Legal Services Authority, as the case may be, shall decide the quantum of compensation to be awarded under the scheme referred to in subsection 1. Now, a conjoint reading of subsection 1 and subsection 2 of 357A goes on to suggest that what is important is that such victim compensatory scheme or victim rehabilitation scheme should have been instituted to begin with. However, the problem here is that in response to an RTI that I had filed in the wake of the Delhi gang rape incident on 18 December, the reply that I received is most shocking. It goes on to suggest that out of 28 states, there are only 6 states who have framed such policies. Now, this was instituted by Act 5 of 2008 with effect from 31st December 2009, which gives 10, 11, 12, 13, 4 years. And no such victim compensatory scheme has been established in a majority of states in India. Furthermore, I further tried to find out in another question in my RTI which tried to address this issue was as to how many cases, in how many such cases compensatory amount has been disbursed and what is the cumulative amount which has been disbursed. So you would be shocked to know again that in India, there have been only 11 people who have been compensated till date. And the quantum of such compensation is is not even more than 5 lakh rupees, whereas there have been dedicated funds allotted to the tune of over 150 crores to the Ministry of Law and Justice, to the Legal Services Authority, to the National Legal Services Authority. If such is the state of plight, then this raises certain prominent questions. And before raising them, I would like to quote Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said that one of the things that's often forgotten about victim rehabilitation is that it is not her destiny, it is a journey which is going on. And journey it is, because for a woman who has to survive this catastrophe, to endure a denigrating medical treatment that have already been highlighted, a pitiable and pathetic process of cross-examination, and with boomeranging notions of justice, and with little or no concern whatsoever which is shown to that woman who is at the center, and who is the person who has actually initiated this criminal justice dispensing mechanism and set it to motion. Her rights are tarnished at every single step that the justice takes its course. Now, to quote Justice P.V. Reddy, he has also said that the role of victim begins when she files an FIR. The victim's right to have a counsel whose status is that of a junior counsel in actual trial, because the prosecution is led by the state. His status is reduced, so she cannot ask those questions. She can, at best what she can do is, she can give a list of questionnaire which will be put up, and it is the discretion of the prosecution, of the public prosecutor, to take into account those questions or not. Which goes on to suggest that that the role that is being actually played, her status itself is denigrated to a considerable extent. Now, when this is one part of it, that what the status that the RTI is revealed, there is a second limb to this argument which says that there have been certain cases, and we have analyzed an entire trajectory of cases pertaining to this 357A provision. Now, those cases suggest that fortunately or otherwise, this incident was reported, because of which a total compensatory amount of 17 lakh rupees was given. However, there have been many such incidents. On that very particular day, on 17th December, when this incident was first reported, on page 3 of the Times of India and page 6 of the Hindu, there was also a very small column that a Dalit girl had immolated herself on account of rape. However, no such compensatory mechanism. There were a host of other stories that were reported in the aftermath of the Delhi gang rape incident. However, when this compensatory amount and this rehabilitation is not given, which is her right, because under Article 24, under Article 21, her right to dignity has already been taken away. Now, if this has been done, then should the state not be casted upon a duty to take steps so that compensation or rehabilitation mechanism could be provided? Now, these cases, under various judgments of the High Court, the states have taken a novel view. Since there was no compensatory mechanism, so every single litigant had to file a 226 writ petition or an Article 32 writ petition to approach the Honorable High Court or approach the Supreme Court, so that they, in the exercise of the power under Article 142, which is the inherent power of the Supreme Court, or in cases, I don't know where the High Courts do derive their power from, but they used to disburse that amount under Article 226 to the victims. Now, this is happening, and there are more than 11 such cases that are reported only in the state of Assam. There are 5 cases in Delhi High Court, 7 cases in Gujarat High Court, 5 cases in Rajasthan High Court, 12 cases in Madhya Pradesh High Court, and 15 cases in Bombay High Court, which goes on to suggest that such compensation was provided by the High Court. So, what is happening is this: my right as a victim has been taken away, and if I do not have the means to approach the High Court, my grievances are not redressed. Justice has to come to the victims. Victims should not go and approach appellate courts to get themselves redressed, which is one basic thing that is happening. Now, under Article 51C, read with Article 253, it is imperative, a constitutional obligation of the Union of India to take into account and to formulate its laws which are in conformity with the international covenants and the International United Nations Declaration. And one of those declarations which I deem very fit for the present discourse that we are having is the Declaration of Basic Principles of Justice for Victims of Crimes and Abuse of Power, which was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1985. Now, the definition of victim that we have used in our CRPC has been lifted from this declaration itself. And of particular reference is Article 12, which casts an obligation on the Home Ministry and the Ministry of Women and Child Development, central government, to make such laws. This article goes something like this: when compensation is not fully available from the offender or other sources, states should endeavor to provide financial compensation to victims who have sustained significant bodily injury or impairment of physical or mental health as a result of serious crimes. The family, in particular, dependents of persons who have died or become physically or mentally incapacitated as a result of such victimization. And 13, the establishment, strengthening and expansion of national funds for compensation to victims should be encouraged. Where appropriate, other funds may also be established for this purpose, including in those cases where the state of which the victim is a national is not in a position to compensate the victim of the harm. So in all those cases, this is a very important theory which comes in the backdrop, which goes on to suggest that in such cases where the offenders are not in a position to compensate the victims, it is the responsibility and the primordial duty of the state to step in and to provide such rehabilitation and compensation. Furthermore, there are other United Nations General Assembly resolutions, and I would only take one more of them, which is a UNGA resolution, and these United Nations General Assembly resolutions, for the record, have been endorsed by the Supreme Court of India in a catena of its judgments, including the SIT judgment, which was the Special Investigation Tribunal for the human rights violations committed in Gujarat. Also, this goes on to suggest that the nation state shall develop in a comprehensive way preventive approaches and all those measures of legal, political, administrative and cultural nature that promote the protection of women against any form of violence and ensure that the re-victimization of women does not occur because of laws insensitive to gender considerations, enforcement practices or other interventions. Work to ensure to the maximum extent feasible in the light of the available resources and where needed within the framework of international cooperation that women subjected to violence and where appropriate their children have specialized assistance such as rehabilitation, assistance in childcare and maintenance, treatment, counseling and health and social services, facilities and programs as well as support structures, and should take all other appropriate measures to promote their safety and physical and psychological rehabilitation. So this system of rehabilitation may be alien to India, but it was not so in other countries, because the jurisprudential trajectory that has existed in other countries goes as far as the year 1967, where the first victim compensation scheme was established, and that was done in the USA. Now, there were other countries which developed heavily, and we have carried out an analysis of over 57 such countries and host of cases which go on to suggest that victims whose right to life, which is a basic human right and not only a constitutional guarantee which is available to the victim, in case this right is violated, they have a legitimate claim before the tribunal to get themselves redressed. And I think that would be all that I can.
Now, with these three very powerful presentations from Aparna, from Mrinal and from Nipun, the two of the first ones are talking about the Verma Committee and the incident and breaking down the legal analysis, largely definitional analysis and others, also punishment part, which all is of great value. But Nipun has spoken on judicial process much more, because he is handling a PIL and the issues that he has raised before, and very largely the compensation issue, how the courts are going to react to it, respond to it. But he didn't make it clear whether he's asking for interim compensation or the post-crime compensation. There could be interim compensation. So
Yes.
the case of Bodhisattva Gautam, where interim compensation was given. And in the context of our society, interim compensation is much more important because it gives her strength to fight it out. Otherwise, she would be tired by the time the final case conviction is recorded and she gets the final compensation. Those are the issues. But now when you talk of law, when you talk of judicial process, and you talk before an audience which is a criminology perspective, rich in criminology perspective, how do you wed the two? What benefit this audience gets from you? What benefit you have got from this audience? Because this is the task of this kind of exercise. It should not be one way, it should be both ways. We learn from criminological perspective, hard law people, hard law analysis, and you learn from hard law analysis, because law, whether you like it or not, is a very important intervening reality in the domain of criminology. Criminology may not like law, sociology perspective, social work perspective, we can do away with law, but then law is a very important reality. So we have to learn the criminology way. So this is a wedding of the two ways of seeing a social problem of gender injustice. And I think the floor is open for questions.